Good evening, Crypt Keepers, and welcome to Cryptique, where we discuss all things paranormal, occult, UFOs, metaphysical, hidden history, forbidden archaeology, a little bit of true crime, and everything truther. I'm joined as always by a man who held his breath for 5 minutes, but is still responsible for global warming. Right. What's up?
Not a whole lot. I think this is our first repeat guest. We've had a lot of conversation about bringing certain people back, but I think Steve's the first one that's actually brave enough to lower himself to our level again.
Well, yeah, he contacted us because this is an evolving issue, and the some of the things that he's going to talk about tonight. Well, most of the things he didn't talk about at all in the first episode. So yeah, we're excited to have him back, and maybe we'll bring some other people back. Why don't you guys let us know at cryptiquepodcast@gmail.com who you want to come back on the show, or if there's somebody out there that you want us to get, then shoot us an email and we'll see what we can do. Sometimes people respond and, say they're busy. Sometimes they don't respond at all, but an overwhelming majority are very amicable to coming on the show and discussing things. So I think it's better when you're on the show because you bring a lot more technical knowledge of the topics that we cover. But, it is what it is.
Well,
but
I appreciate that.
Well, of course.
I also don't get worked up as much as you. Sometimes the most fun part of the show is watching you get like just as amped up or more than the guest who's talking about something.
Yeah, sometimes it frustrates me, man. It is so frustrating when you just want people to look into something or to just click the like button. All right, we'll tell them what they need to know.
Please like, subscribe, and share. All of our socials will be in the show notes. It really helps us out and helps us with the algorithm. You can let us know what you want to hear next or what guest you want us to bring back at cryptiquepodcast@gmail.com, like Jay already said. You can see what we're selling over at cryptiquepodcaststore.com, and you can help us keep the servers on over at buymeacoffee.com/cryptiquepi.
It's good stuff. You don't have to do it all, just one. Just one. Come on, help us out a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. As we mentioned, Cryptique is proud to bring back the energy outlaw. You know him from his new book on the coming renewable energy failure, Green Breakdown. Steve's book has countless slides and easy-to-read graphs and charts, so you don't feel like you're reading a research paper. That's why his book is so cool, at least for me. So, with 30 years of Fortune 100 and private company experience, he serves as the executive director of the Climate Science Coalition of America and a policy advisor to the Heartland Institute. So, we're not talking about a guy that lives in his mom's basement and wears a tinfoil hat. This is a CEO type gentleman that brings a tremendous amount of credibility. So with that, we'd like to welcome back
water. Where 2 years
Steve
ago it
Goreham.
was a drought that was caused by man-made climate change. Go figure.
Yeah, go figure. When we started this, I actually asked ChatGPT just to see what it would say, because that's going to kind of pull a really broad general answer.
Okay.
What causes climate change? And it says, the basic principle centers around greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trapping heat. It said, but it's considerably more complex due to various factors and feedback mechanisms. And it talks a little bit about, the way the climate and the earth generally react to changes, how some of these changes are natural, the changing of like ocean currents and the way they cool the atmosphere, and, even like the Dust Bowl, that was kind of at least a weather change that was because of the way land was being used. So it's just the only point I'm getting at is that it's a lot more complicated than more gas equals hotter.
Oh, yes, it is. Absolutely.
You can't necessarily confuse weather with climate.
Earth's climate is very complex, and you're right, dust is one of those factors. Desert dust, pollen from plants goes up and affects cloud formation, volcanic dust. There are many, many factors that affect the climate, and carbon dioxide is only a very small part of much of it.
All right, let's see here. All right, so to go back over things real quick, we talked about David Viner in his comment that children aren't going to know what snow is. Snow is not disappearing. The average annual number of deaths from disasters is minuscule compared to what it was with way more people in
Right.
1920. Famine has been almost eliminated or close to it. The warm climates are safer because the sickness happens, the illness happens more often in the winter, whether you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. And obviously, people loved Florida. The guy that wrote the population bomb, trying to scare people into, I guess, just reading his book, Paul Ehrlich. We talked about the camel killers. And so now we're at President Biden has halted the approval of new liquefied natural gas terminals. What can you tell us about that? I'm a little ignorant to that, so dumb it down for me.
Right. So, President, we've been building liquefied gas terminals for a number of years now. Ever since we had the hydraulic fracturing revolution, which occurred in the around the year 2000, geologists and petroleum engineers figured out how to get oil and gas out of shale fields, and really revolutionized the industry. And the U.S. since then has become the biggest producer of oil and of natural gas. We're also the biggest exporter of those in the world. And when Europe had their energy crisis a year or two ago, starting before the Ukraine invasion by Russia, and then afterwards, and they were not getting supplies of natural gas from Russia, we kept the lights on last winter by shipping vast quantities of liquefied natural gas from all these terminals on our coasts. And they take the gas and they make it very cold, and they could put a lot of it in tanks and ship it. And then it goes to Europe and it's warmed up by terminals. Mr. Biden, though, he's kind of thrown a pretty big bone to the environmental groups. He's decided to halt on the building of new terminals. The ones that are still there can operate.
Yeah.
But, this whole thing is really crazy. I often ask audiences, or when I get a chance, which energy source has done the most to reduce air pollution globally? And because we have, a lot of people think, wow, wind and solar, but the answer is none of those. My grandfather, I live in Chicago part of the year. My grandfather in the 1950s had a coal furnace in his basement.
Mm-hmm.
And many people did in Chicago. They probably did in St. Louis as well. And after 5 days after it snowed, you could see a black film on the snow in Chicago during the winter, and that was coal dust. And young folks that are listening or viewing probably don't know what spring cleaning was for. Spring cleaning in the 1950s, people literally would wash the inside of their walls on all of their houses to remove the coal dust. But then we put natural gas in our homes. And when you put natural gas in a home for heating in place of either coal or in place of burning wood, you reduce particulates by a factor of 1,000. And so the answer is, the thing that has cleaned up our air the most has been the switch to natural gas and propane, and the elimination of coal for heating. So environmentalists have it exactly wrong. They're trying to ban natural gas. They want President Biden to stop gas shipments. But this is the thing that has done the most to clean up air pollution across the world. And the great news is, by the way, we are now, many places in the world are still burning biomass to heat their homes or for cooking. They're burning charcoal, and they're burning wood, and they're burning dung. And they get really lousy air. Their air pollutants are up by a factor of 100 in a home where this is being done versus the United States. and people get diseases and they die from lung diseases. The really great news is that just 3 years ago, according to the United Nations, more people are now in poor nations are using modern fuels. They're using gas, and they're using a liquid propane gas to cook with. And so this is solving the problem of people breathing in fumes from biomass. In India, for example, Prime Minister Modi has had a program going for about 7 or 8 years now. He has all these centers where they are distributing liquid propane gas canisters to people. They give them the canisters, and I think sometimes they buy them, and sometimes they hand them out to something like 50 million families, so that they can cook with gas instead of using biomass, and it's just a tremendous advantage. So our gas fuels are the things that are cleaning up the air, and they're really, really good for society. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people saying, well, they emit carbon dioxide when you burn them, which again doesn't do anything except help make the plants grow.
Yeah. I have a couple different thoughts. One of the things that I was thinking of, I think we talked about last time, was that a while ago I was behind like a 67 Dart, and it smelled terrible. And there were no emission controls back then.
Yeah.
So cars, I mean, they'd be dirty. Like the rear of them would be dirty because of soot and stuff coming out of the tailpipe. And a lot of that has been solved. I've read before that, an average lawnmower pollutes more than a car does because there's not really emission controls for them. And yeah, and I don't think you're ever going to get rid of people burning biomass to heat their homes, or even because they just like to. I read a report a while ago that in the US, even though we know burning wood in our fireplace makes the air worse in the house and can oftentimes make the rest of your house colder, like 70% of people still prefer a fireplace. But I think,
well, again, if you have a furnace, you're doing that and you're venting it to the outside, then you're okay as well. But a lot of these folks are just cooking with an open fire in the middle of their hut, and that's a problem. But you're right, vehicle emissions are way, way down, according to the EPA, and I think it's the EPA. Volatile organic compounds, which are a measure of what comes out of your tailpipe, are down 98% since 1970. Just a tremendous accomplishment. So pretty much almost all. Now, I wouldn't advise you to run a car in your garage and stay in there, but almost all of that stuff is gone now. Mostly everything that comes from a car tailpipe is water vapor and carbon dioxide. Very little other stuff in the modern vehicles.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I've heard a lot of true crime stories where they talk about, someone had a newer Hyundai or something like that, and they, like their wife came home and they had been sitting in the garage all day with the car running, and they were fine. So,
Well, maybe again, don't try this at home, folks,
right.
But it really is a good news story. And similarly for trucks emissions are down quite a bit from what they were. And a lot of those are the catalytic converters and the fuels and the other things that we're doing to cleaning up our vehicles.
Mm-hmm. And I was kind of leading into that because I wanted to go back to where you had talked about the number of deaths per year it's kind of laid out per decade in your slide. We're talking natural disasters that tend to be linked to climate change, right? I mean, we're talking like...
Well, some of them are. The one big one is earthquakes that really nobody is trying to link to climate change, but droughts, and actually drought is a very big killer of people across the world when we have droughts, but storms, of course, hurricanes, droughts, floods, those sorts of things.
Okay. I am wondering if part of the reduction in deaths over time is potentially due to improved fuel sources and less pollution, while not necessarily removing the CO2 that everybody's worried about.
Probably improved structures, I would say, would be bigger in many ways. There's also, we're able to warn about things like tidal waves often get people away from shores, and so the forecasting is much, much better for storms. A lot of times people didn't know a storm was coming in the old days. Now we have all this radar in these planes, and so we can tell people when hurricanes are coming, and they can They can move from shore. They can do a lot of other things. So much of this is early warning systems, is radar, and it's stronger structures. We now have strong concrete structures. By the way, that's what I often say when I speak to groups. The way to reduce deaths from climate is to adapt. It's to build seawalls. It's to build in the Caribbean right now. We still have a lot of buildings that aren't very strong. We need to get the income levels up of those nations so they can build strong concrete structures, which would be more resilient to storms. But that's part of the way that the society improves and adapts.
Okay. Yeah, and then I mean, when we talked about famine, I would think that in some ways the use of fossil fuels probably would be related to the reduction in death
Absolutely.
per decade, because my fiance and I just drove to a small farm town not too far from here and spent a little bit of time there. We were kind of just talking about how there are these small towns around Illinois that I'm sure you've seen where they were clearly farming communities and they've almost been abandoned. And we were kind of talking about that that's probably because it used to take 30, 40, maybe even 100 people to run a farm. But once we had the internal combustion engine, I mean, you could do the work of 20 or 30 people with two guys. And now in a lot of cases, there are small family farms where it's mostly the family and a few hired hands along with some equipment that can do all this stuff. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who've been saved by these productivity increases and the use of these fuels that are now so scary. Now we have people laying in the middle of highways saying stop oil.
Productivity is way, way up. That's one of the reasons why we've had a migration to cities across the world out of agriculture. We used to have, I'm trying to remember the numbers. I think about 1900, just about one of every two people was in agriculture. And now it's about 3 out of 100. It's very, very small. And the productivity is very high. Another question I like to ask audiences is what agricultural event occurred in the year 2000? Most people don't know that. But in the year 2000, the amount of agricultural land, farmland, and pasture land actually began to decline on planet Earth. It's been dropping now for the last 2 decades. For all of history, as population has grown, we've used more and more land to produce agricultural products. But farmers are now so productive, they can grow so much. We don't need to put so much land into farming. And a perfect example is corn in the United States. Corn land peaked in 1918 in the United States, and we're using less land for corn today. Even though we're using a lot for ethanol, it's still less than the peak in 1918. But the output is about up by a factor of 10 since 1918. So farmers are very, very productive. With tractors, with synthetic fertilizer, with a lot of the things we do now, we can produce huge amounts of food. So the great story is farmers are actually giving land back to nature now globally on average. And that's first time in history that has happened.
Well, down here, they're giving land to Amazon warehouses and distribution centers, but it is good to know that people aren't just selling the land because they're being offered a lot of money, but because we actually can make do with a lower footprint for food production.
Well, I also feel like farmers are at the mercy of the government. They're so intertwined now. You got to do this. You got to do this to get your subsidies. You got to do that. If we want you to burn your crop because there's too much of it, you got to burn your crop. And we've taken the kind of the farming out of being a farmer. You just do what the government says.
A lot of that going on. Yeah.
All right. So go ahead.
I was just going to ask, we're talking about St. Louis a little bit, and in the last few weeks, I've actually thought of our last conversation a few times because we've had days where it's gone from, what would you say, Jay, like 75, I think, down to 19 the one day. which is a pretty big swing. I mean, St. Louis has been that way for as
Yeah.
long as I can remember, but a lot of people point to things like that and say, look at this. Like, is this not an indication of a problem? But then if you look up the historical data,
Yep.
like there was a day that it almost got up to 80, but that's
Mhm.
not the hottest it's ever been. The hottest
Right.
it ever was in St. Louis in February was like in 1972. But are these sort of
Yeah,
more erratic?
Missouri's maximum temperature record was 118, according to NOAA data. It was a tie. It was in Union and Warsaw, July 14th, 1954, was your hottest maximum temperature.
Yeah.
By the way, it's kind of interesting. You can go to a site called State Extremes at NOAA, and you can learn that 23 of the 50 state high temperature records were set in the 1930s. 23 of the 50, and then 36 of the 50 were set in the 1970s or earlier. And so, just another piece of information that says we've had warm temperatures in the past, and what we see now really isn't abnormal.
Well, are these big swings in temperature, these drastic changes, are they statistically unusual, or
No, I
is
don't
there
think
data
so.
for that? Okay.
I don't think so. Again, we've seen 1 degree Celsius of warming since 1880 globally. About 2 degrees Fahrenheit in 140 years. That is not abnormal in history. There have been many, many periods when it's been warmer naturally, despite the fact that the United Nations now says we're in the era of global boiling, and that's just flat out wrong. We've had many times, 1,000 years ago when the Vikings settled southwest Greenland, it was warmer than today. 2,000 years ago during the Roman warming, when the Roman soldiers conquered the Mediterranean, those little skirts, they were growing olives in what was to become Germany, and they were making growing grapes and making wine in what was to become England back in those days, and that isn't done today. It's just not as warm as it was, and all that was before we had power plants and sport utility vehicles. So we're not in abnormally warm temperatures, and I don't think the temperatures are fluctuating more than they did in the past either.
Okay.
Now, we talked
It
a
does
little
seem like
bit.
something people pay attention to a lot, though. That's the only reason I bring it up. Just, I'm sure somebody listening to this will think about
Well,
that. Like, well, we had a weird
that's
swing here. We've
natural.
had weird weather. Yeah.
That's natural. Wow, I can never remember this in my 50 years of existence. It's very, very hot or it's very, very cold, but they don't realize that that's happened in the past.
Right. Now, so Hillary Clinton has come out and called for us to track climate deaths. And
Right.
I wondered, I just wanted to get back to that for a second. To your knowledge, has she come out with any sort of like this one is going to be considered a death from climate change, like any kind of specifics, or is it just another politician that's like, oh, we got to do something?
Yeah, I think it's a method to message. A lot of times the leaders say, well, we got this problem and we're just not messaging it properly. People aren't accepting it. So we have to find another way to message it. You hear that all the time, depending on what the issue is, to convince people. But the fact is, we're not seeing more deaths. Matter of fact, as I wanted to say earlier, the use of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, and the emissions of carbon dioxide are very, very closely correlated to all the good things we've seen in society over the last 100 years, to rising education levels, to declining infant mortality, to rises in gross domestic product. All of those things are very closely tied to the use of hydrocarbon fuels. And so you really got to say, well, if we didn't have these things, our society wouldn't. We're in an era of low cost, abundant energy right now. 80% of our energy comes from hydrocarbons still, and it's the thing that drives societies to improve. And lifespan is another one that's very closely tied to the rise in use of hydrocarbon fuels.
Yeah, and I was listening to an economics podcast a while ago when they were talking about developing nations using coal and things like that more. essentially just dirtier fuel sources.
They
But
are.
the counter argument to it was, we did it. Why would we deprive them of doing it during their industrialization?
The real key thing is to reduce real pollutants from those.
Mm-hmm.
And we put scrubbers on our coal plants, and we have critical combustion coal plants and new technologies. We want to reduce the sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, ozone particulates, lead. We've taken lead out of our vehicle fuel. Those are the things that can hurt people and need to be reduced. But carbon dioxide is not one of those. That doesn't harm people in any way. And so we've gotten off track here from reducing real pollution to trying to reduce carbon dioxide, which is just the wrong way to go.
Why do you think that nobody's talking about plastics? Is it just because everybody's getting filthy rich? Because that's what I see as a problem. And I don't mean even speaking from a greenhouse gas point of view. I'm talking about you can watch a survivalist show where they go on a deserted island anywhere or deep into the Amazon rainforest, and they're looking for things that they can use to survive. And there's trash everywhere. There's trash everywhere.
Plastics are a problem. I think it's sometimes overstated, particularly plastics in the ocean. But we have roughly, it's estimated 100 million tons of plastic in the ocean. Usually it's very small particles. We're adding about 10 million tons a year. We do need and by the way, none of that really, very little is Europe and from the US. Most of it's developing nations in Asia. But it is a problem. We need biodegradable plastics, which are more expensive, to help solve that problem. And I think the industry is working toward that. That's something that we need to do. But the idea that if we ban straws in St. Louis, that we're going to solve that problem, that's really not accurate.
Yeah.
But they need containers that are going to degrade with sunlight, that sort of thing, and then you just won't be able to leave your milk carton out in the sun. But
well, it's funny
that is
because
a problem to solve. Yeah.
It's funny because, it started off, it sounded like a great idea. Hey, let's have, let me see, metal water bottles. Cool. I've had this for about 5 years, but I see people and they're like, oh, you've got to check out my huge collection of water bottles that I'm saving the world with. I've got 30 different ones and I've got all these different styles and it's like, well, I thought the whole point was just so you would just have one bottle, not that you would still have 30 or 50. And it's like the thing now to collect cool water bottles. So
Diner water bottles. Yeah. Well, I'm a tap water guy. I don't really like water in plastic bottles typically, but people are going to use it. So that is a problem to be solved. Another one that we may have mentioned is discharge of untreated water. 80% of the world is still dumping wastewater into rivers, lakes, and streams, not treating it. Again, doesn't happen much in wealthy nations, US and Europe. Swimmers 7 years ago didn't want to swim in the water down in Brazil, if you remember, during the Olympics. Brazil's just building their first water treatment plants. So that is a real problem that needs to be solved. We should be putting money towards that rather than reducing carbon dioxide emissions.
Agreed. 100%. I don't understand how people set foot in the Ganges. I mean, they go there to bathe. I know it's a sacred river and all that, but there's literally burning bodies on canoes that get sent down the river to, be cremated. And it just looks like it is the filthiest river in the world. And I'm sure there's a lot like that in China too, but it makes me think, like, if it's that bad, can a water treatment facility even fix it? I mean, it's not going to hurt it, but I wouldn't, if someone said, hey, this is water from the Ganges, but we ran it through a water treatment, I'd be like, no, that's okay. Is that something that can even be fixed at this point, or is it just too nasty to try and fix?
Let me kind of take a higher level view of this. If you look at environmental damage, and you look at the life of a nation, and this is often plotted on a couple of axes. There's a theory called the environmental Kuznets curve. And on the vertical axis, it plots pollution or environmental damage. And on the horizontal axis, it plots the wealth of a nation, dollars per person or whatever the wealth measure is. When nations are poor and they're young and they don't have food and they don't have things, they don't have health care and they don't have all the things that we take for granted, they don't care too much about what goes into the air and the water. And so as their income levels increase, we find the environment degrades. And you have kind of a rising curve that as they get wealthier, the environment gets worse and worse. But then at some point they reach something called a turning point income, and they look around and say, you know, we have the means now to clean up the air and the water. And by the way, it's really bad. And from then on, they start cleaning up their air and water. And then this curve takes a curve down. So it's kind of an inverted U. And as they get wealthier, they get over this thing called the, what's the name of the top? I can't remember the name of the peak in this thing. But then they start cleaning up their environment and pollution goes down as they get wealthy and wealthier, the environment gets cleaned up. And we see that in all nations of the world. You can see that for air pollution. You can see it for water pollution. A recent example is China. If you look at air particulate pollution in China, it peaked about 2012, 2014. It went up that Kuznets curve, and now it is trending down across China. So you see this in all nations. So what I like to tell audiences, the thing to reduce environmental damage or pollution is not to restrict energy use. It is to build the wealth of nations. And as they get older, another example is Mexico City. Mexico City in the 90s was rated the most polluted city in the world. It's surrounded by mountains and the pollution would just kind of stay there. But they put in mass transit and they put in a lot of methods as they got wealthier. Now Mexico City is much, much better today than it was. So the good news is that humans and society are going to clean up their environment. We need to get the wealth level of poor nations up, and they will start to clean up their air and water as well.
That makes sense. I hope that they do. I'm glad to hear that China's pollution is kind of taking a downturn, but I also feel like a lot of countries just don't care. And I'm surprised that China cares unless it's just to kind of clean up its global image a little bit. But it's good to hear, and it does make sense. But I agree with what Ryan said too. It's like, you know, we can't go to a developing country and be like, listen, you're going to have to use your ox to plow this field. You can't use a gas tractor, but when you can afford, you know, a $500,000 all electric solar powered combine, you can do it because they'll never get there.
No, I think they will all get there. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of getting wealthier. Another example is forests.
Mm-hmm.
Forests are still declining globally, according to the United Nations, who tracks forest area. But the good news is that forests, the rate of forest loss is declining. It's lower this decade than it was the decade before and the decade before that. We are still losing forests in Central and South America, in Central Africa, and in Southeast Asia. But we now have something like 80 nations where forests are either flat or forests are growing. And this is the United States, Europe, Russia, China, even India. I'm sorry, not India. The United States, Europe, Russia, China, Australia, New Zealand all have growing forests. But what we need to do with the poor nations is get them onto modern fuels, and they won't be cutting down their forests to burn. And we need to get them modern agricultural techniques so they can get high yield and they don't need to use so much land. But I predict by 2050, we will probably have net forest growth globally. So again, all these things, people do the right thing over time. And it really is a question of income and their state of development.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean,
That's-
they're probably thinking like, I don't have time to worry about this stuff. I got to get food for my family. But
That's right.
once they've hit the, I think it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once they've got those basic needs met, then they can focus on something else. But right
Work
now,
on
they're
the
just
environment.
focused on, yeah, they're just focused on food for my family, keeping out of the rain, and watch out for lions.
Yep.
All right, so. We talked a little bit about this last time, but I feel like it's gotten worse, and I feel like people are starting to catch on a little bit with these EVs about the insurance to start off with. I wonder, have you come across or have you considered like plotting a graph of some sort that shows like the average lifetime expectancy cost on a certain particular EV? Because we used to see when they would come out um, with like reviews on cars, they would come out with cost of ownership, and I haven't seen that in a while.
Well, there's people doing studies all the time. I do talk about that in Green Breakdown. There was a group in Michigan that looked at cost of ownership and concluded that even the cost of gasoline versus charging, if you did a certain amount of public charging, it would be more expensive with an EV. And then they also took into account the time that was required going to search for a charging station. And again, if you weren't doing all your charging at home, and they charged it to a certain hourly rate, it was very, very expensive to have an EV. We've seen some other things recently. This last year, the price of used electric vehicles dropped 20% in the United States. So what you can get for an EV on the resale market now is much, much lower than what it was. Part of that is the rental companies are getting rid of EVs. Hertz originally said they would buy 100,000 Teslas. I think they ended up buying about 60,000, and now they are putting 20 of those out of their fleets, 20,000 of those 60, because there's a couple reasons. One's announced and one isn't, but they're saying to maintain those and to repair them if they get into a collision is very, very costly. The insurance is costly. And part of the reason is if you have a little bit of an impact and you damage the battery in any way, then you've got to replace up to a $20,000 battery. Very, very expensive. But the other thing that I think they're saying is that people are saying, we just don't want to rent this EV. Typically, if you rent a car, you want to go a distance. You're not doing a short distance. You want to drive it to another state or something else. And then they have a lot of problems with charging. And so there's just a bunch of things that are occurring with electric vehicles. Cost to insurance about 70% more than a gasoline car in the United States. In England, up to £5,000 a year to insure an electric car, very expensive. So there's a lot of problems building up with electric vehicles. I'm trying to remember if I told you that quip about Chicago last time I was on. Did I give you that in the winter?
Yeah, tell us again though, because we may have some people that missed the first episode, and this is something that should have been foreseen. Somebody dropped the ball, or they're just trying to sugarcoat everything.
This is known that it was on national news. They had all these cars being pushed around the charging stations. Nobody could get their car charged in Chicago when it got down to about zero. And by the way, when you're not supposed to be running the heater when you're charging your car. So the people sitting in these places, their EVs weren't charging, and they were freezing sitting in these cars. But so the quip in Chicago is 90% of all EVs ever made are still on the road, and 10% of them made it home. But it's been well known that these batteries don't, the cars lose 20% of their range when it gets cold. And when it gets down to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, you literally cannot charge unless you have a heated garage or a heated facility. So they're not for everybody. They're better in the south part of the US, not so good in Chicago and the northern areas.
Well, there's a
Yeah,
lot of
and
areas where it gets cold in the winter. So,
Yep.
I mean, it's not like we're talking Chicago. We're not talking about the North Pole. And I know it gets really cold, but man, there's a lot of places that get that cold. And if you essentially say you can't use your vehicle for the winter when you're north of this latitude, I, I don't know. I
or
just
Yeah.
or you have to put so much work into preparation. Because I saw some statement from Tesla saying that there's a way to precondition your battery to
You
warm it up
can
so it'll
you
charge.
can
But
pre-charge to warm it up. Yeah. But again, that
yeah,
takes more time.
you're right, right. It takes more time, and not everybody knows that you need to do that. They're used to going to a gas station, spending 3 minutes there, filling it up, and then driving away.
Yep. Yep.
Since
There
our
are some
last
ways.
since our last conversation, I've resisted the urge to buy a Tesla because I keep seeing them get cheaper and cheaper. Now you can get one for like a Model 3 for 18,000 with like 50,000 miles on it. And
Yeah.
it's like, man, there's a reason the prices are going down like that. And even when I was at a dealership recently, they had a Hyundai Ioniq 5 sitting there, and I
Okay.
was talking to one of the it wasn't even a salesman, it was somebody from their service department that I just happened to be chatting with while we were waiting for something, and I was asking like, how are those? And he's like, oh, those are terrible. He's like, they're so hard to work on, they're so expensive. He's like, a lot of people who have them, who bring them back here for something, they just they want to get out of it. They want to get something else. And he was even talking about that the price to charge at a public station, like you were saying, depending on how they charge it, is as much as gas. And then you have the increased insurance cost.
Well, it can be, and another big secret is nobody is making money at these charging stations. That is, it's a lost system. There's no way that any of these guys can make money because these chargers, a 50 kilowatt DC high speed charger costs $100,000. A gas pump costs $20,000. And then imagine if you had all this system of gasoline stations, and people found a way to fill up 80% at home. That means you would take 80% of the business away from all these gas stations. And that's what people do with EVs right now. They want to charge at home, but they still want the charging stations to be out on the road. So, and you look at the stock prices on these EV companies. I mean, the EV charging companies have crashed. I think what's going to happen eventually is that utilities are going to take these things over, and they're going to charge ratepayers to help subsidize EV charging, and then we're going to have state and federal governments subsidizing it as well. Because in the capital markets, there just doesn't appear to be a way for these charging companies to make money.
Yeah, well, and I feel like the charging situation, I mean, a lot of the problems with EVs come down to charging, but I think with a rental in particular, because for work, I used to travel a lot, and I would rent a car wherever I was at, like Seattle or Phoenix or something like that. And it wasn't necessarily that I was going particularly far from my hotel, but if I had to plot out where exactly the charging stations were, or make sure I reserved a room at a hotel that had a charger there, because I know in my town where they are. There's a couple of them, but if I was going somewhere else, I'd have no idea. I mean, even if I was going to see family that live a couple hours away, I have no idea where I would charge if I was trying to get there and then get home.
I wonder if they charge minibar prices for charging your car. They'd be like, oh, well, normally it's $30 to charge your car, but since you're at a hotel, it's $400 to charge it.
Yeah, but
The other thing is there are a whole host of different charging rates, different credit cards people use. I mean, this stuff isn't standardized and it's complex.
Yeah.
And then you got these things that aren't working. People pull up and they're not working. Part of the reason is that, again, charging companies, I don't think, can afford to maintain these. Or if it's cold, you got other issues too. So it's something, it'll get worked out over time, but it's a big problem right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's not ready to be rolled out like this. It's just not. If you can't solve the problem of cold charging without spending an extra $5,000 on something or something like that, it's not ready. It's
the
like
problem is the force that you got to do this. You know,
Right.
that the governments are forcing it. If we would let the market take its path, it would develop. But you know, we're going to save the planet, so everybody's got to drive an EV. That's the part that's goofy.
Yeah, I keep seeing things from dealers and on YouTube and on like the local news here where they're saying nobody's really buying EVs. We don't know how we're going to meet this mandate or meet any
Yep.
mandates because it seems like people who want EVs have them.
Yeah, I think you're right. The early adopters have them, or if you want a cool Tesla for your second car,
Right.
that works too. But if it's your main, if you live in an apartment, you got to stretch a cable over the public walkway. That's not a good idea.
Yeah,
Have you
actually, I
guys seen
watched
this
a video.
video? Are you going to tell about the woman that?
No.
Okay.
I watched one from this kid. He's probably like 27, 28, and he had I think a standard range Model 3, and he was talking about what it was like to live with it in an apartment. And
Yeah.
he was talking about, you know, he would just plan his day while he was at the gym. He would plug it in, or certain places he knew he could plug it in. He was like, okay. And then the question everybody always asks, would you buy another one? And he was like, nope, I would absolutely not buy another one. I would not recommend you buy one. He's like, I'm going to keep it because I have it, and it'd be expensive to try to sell it and
Take a
find
huge
something
loss.
new. There's a lot of transaction cost in that. Yeah. He's like, but I wouldn't buy one.
There's this great video I just saw of this woman who pulled into somebody's driveway. They saw that the guy had a charger. She just pulled in his driveway and plugged her Tesla in, and he comes out and he's like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm just charging my car. Don't worry about it. And he's like, well, this is my house. This isn't a charging station. She's like, you got a charger. I need my car charged. I'm here. It's no big deal. Just wait. And he's going to unplug it. And she gets
Boy.
like she's ready to fight. And it's like, would you just pull into somebody's garage and like plug your phone into their garage and be, I'm just charging my phone. It's no big deal. It is insane. And it's crazy people like that she's probably like, I'm saving the environment. Don't you worry about me using your charging station. It's, I don't know. It just struck me as hilarious and kind of goes along with what we're talking about. But yeah, people are taking big losses when they try and sell these cars. And it's like, would you buy a cell phone if they said, hey, it doesn't matter how much you use it, you really have to charge it like every 3 hours? Of course not. And when these vehicles have these low ranges like we're talking about, and they're changing when it's cold, I don't want to have to charge my car. I don't want to have to plug it in 10 times a day so I can get to where I need to go. It's not feasible.
Yeah, like you were saying, I think if things took their natural course, it would be a lot better than trying to mandate it, because Tesla's already switching to LFP, lithium iron phosphate batteries on some of their cars because they use fewer precious metals. They're a little bit better with charging to higher levels. They seem to be somewhat more resilient, but now there are millions of them with lithium batteries out there, just like my phone, which is about a year old, and I'm starting to notice that I have to charge it quite a bit more than I used to. It's like, man, do I want to deal with a car that has a battery like that?
Why are they shooting down hybrids so much? You would think that a hybrid would be a happy median, right? Like, I mean, I know not everybody wants... Yeah, I guess. I mean, I know not everybody wants to drive a Prius or whatever Honda had, the Echo or whatever, but I also see, and this is something that is kind of a warning sign for me. When someone shows me a car, I want to know about the motor. I want to know about the transmission. I want to know about the steering. I don't care if it has lighted wheel wells or a fancy light that goes across the top and flashes back and forth. But I see these EVs are all like, they all have this extra kind of little kit stuff that doesn't really cost the companies anymore, but it's like a cool, like a selling point. Like, oh, but check this one out, man. You hit this button and it makes a blue carpet under your car when you're driving, and just looks really cool. And it's got all these weird lights on it looks like a spaceship on the inside. And it's like, I just want something that runs in cold weather.
It's for virtue signaling. It's for signaling that you have an EV. And I mean, I saw this joke a long time ago where a lot of phone cases would show the Apple logo on an iPhone. Like there was a cutout. And it was this joke where they're like, but how will people know I'm better than them? And they're like, well, we have this cutout so I can see it's an iPhone. Like, people want a way to visually distinguish that their car is an EV.
That's true. That's true. I mean, to me, that's when I see stuff like that, it just turns me off, because it's kind of garbage stuff you really don't need. And it's like, if you're like, look over here, look at this stuff, don't worry about the insurance costs. We've got cool lights. And it seems like it's your responsibility as a consumer to do your own research and all that. But I do feel like it's almost like a trick. Like, they want it to look like Ryan's background so they can go in and say, look at me, I'm in a fancy spaceship type car. I don't know. I feel like people are being kind of swindled in that regard, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just an old man now, but that's how I feel. But all right. Well, you have a slide here about the prospects for a green hydrogen economy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, in short, we have this issue with heavy industry. Today, we have vast use of hydrocarbons in the core industries, in ammonia that produces fertilizer, in the chemical industries, in the plastics industries, in steel and other ones. And the folks that are pushing net zero want to convert those industries. Most of them use natural gas today, unless they're in China where they use coal. They want to convert those to using hydrogen fuel. The problem is that we don't have a hydrogen fuel industry today. We just don't. We make about 95 million tons of hydrogen a year, but it's inside a industrial process. It is made and then used immediately to produce something like fertilizer. But people want to create a new fuel industry, because if you burn hydrogen, there are no carbon dioxide waste products from it. You just get water vapor. And so they want to create a new fuel industry, but this is very, very difficult. And so the way they want to do it, is to use electrolysis of water to create hydrogen. You run an electric current through water and you split it into hydrogen and oxygen gas. That is very, very expensive, though. The electricity to do that, just to create 1 kilogram of hydrogen, a very small amount, is like 2 days of electricity for a house in the US. Very, very high. And then they want to take that and use it as a fuel. Well, to be a fuel, you have to be able to transport it. You have to have pipelines. You have to have ships that can carry it. None of that exists today, and hydrogen is very, very hard to transport.
Yeah, doesn't it have to be kept cold and pressurized? Isn't that part of the problem?
You have 2 different methods. You can cool it to minus 253 degrees Celsius within about 25 degrees of absolute zero, or you can pressurize it to 700 atmospheres, which is 300 times the air pressure in the tire of your car. And even when it's at 700 atmospheres, if you put it into tanks at a gas station or a filling station at 700 atmospheres, it takes up 7 times the volume of gasoline for the same energy level. So it's very, very difficult to transport, to store. Yet the world is throwing vast amounts of money at this. Literally, the green hydrogen fuel industry today has a value of about $1 billion. And the governments have already pledged $280 billion in subsidies to try and grow this industry. So I wrote an article that I think was published in the Washington Examiner that says, can government create a new hydrogen fuel industry? And this is very, very, very unlikely. I would urge people and companies to stay out of this. This is going to have a tremendous crash in the next few years. It just is not going to happen.
Yeah, that explains some of what I saw with the Toyota Mirai, which was a hydrogen vehicle. That one of the problems it had, if you could find a place to fill it up, was the nozzle would often ice up, and you couldn't get it off of the port on your car.
Yeah, if it's cold, it would. Well, we have, and there's very few vehicles today. There are a bunch of forklifts that are using hydrogen. There are some experimental trains that are using it and some buses that are using it. But for example, there are no filling stations. California has about 65 of those, and Exxon just said they were going to close about 6 of them. There's one station in Hawaii. That's it. There are no stations. So Toyota wants to build these things, but there's going to be no place to fill them up.
Right.
And this is not something that's going to happen. It's very expensive in California as well. It costs like $80 to fill your tank, and a third of the stations can't get hydrogen. They're just a million problems. And again, nobody would be doing this without the fear of man-made global warming. It just doesn't make any sense.
Steve, you probably didn't have a chance to check it out yet. I did send you an email. A gentleman sent me an email about an ammonia-powered car that a man in Canada made in like 1981. And he just retrofitted this ugly old Impala and ran it. I'm not familiar with all the specifics and stuff like that, but he basically, and they showed him in this recent YouTube video where the car sat for 20 years. He went out, started it right up, and it drove just fine. And is there anything that you're familiar with where people are trying to work with ammonia or anything?
I haven't seen a lot of that, except the biggest idea is to use that to ship hydrogen by first converting it to ammonia, which I think liquefies at something like minus 33 Celsius. So you don't need near as cold of temperatures as a hydrogen. So convert hydrogen to ammonia, ship it on a big ship to another country, and then convert it back. Problem with that is you lose about a third of the energy when you do that. It's not an easy process, but I have not heard of anybody talking about ammonia as a fuel. Again, it's very unlikely it's going to give you any kind of power like gasoline. And there are a lot of environmental hazards with ammonia as well. It's not a very environmentally friendly liquid.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. Like I said, I mean, this was an old beater that this guy had, and yeah, they showed him going about 25 down a level street. So I get what you're saying. You're not going to be able to tow your ditch witch with an ammonia powered engine, most likely.
You can do something with any of these things. The question is it anywhere near as cost effective? And in most cases, they aren't. We had, for example, I talk about in the Green Breakdown, there was this, I can't remember if I mentioned it last time on your show, there was this surgeon in California who was taking human flesh. He was a cosmetic surgeon and converting it to a fuel for his vehicles. He was running his girlfriend's vehicle and his. He got arrested because apparently that's illegal. You can't do that with with human body parts. But you can run just about anything on something if you want to go through the issues.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. I could probably power a car to get back and forth to work a couple times. But hey, I'm working on it. I got a treadmill. What can I say? So this is something that is interesting to me. BlackRock, JP Morgan, and other firms are kind of pulling back on their climate change pledges. All these companies that sought all that virtue signaling, we're going to do all this, we're going to fix everything, just trust. And they're like, well, pulling back, maybe not so much. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is one of the first signs of the Green Breakdown, I think. This was just recently, JP Morgan, State Street, PIMCO, Vanguard, I think Vanguard all announced they were pulling out of a group called Climate Action 100. And a big part of this is ESG, environmental, social, and governance, which they've been pushing for about 5 years as what companies should do. But there was a big E on this ESG, and the big E meant environmental. Let's get rid of coal, oil, and natural gas. That was the real push for this. But we had states in the United States saying, hey, wait a minute. Texas and West Virginia and Florida said, you're going to push this ESG stuff. We're not going to invest any of our pension fund money in your funds. And so they're getting a lot of pushback from folks. And so they've decided to step back on this. The other thing that's happening here that isn't really discussed is that these renewable companies are doing very, very poorly. And I think the big money funds are saying, we have people invest in these and they don't make any money. They're going down. An example is the Renix index, RENIXX, which is an index of, I think, about 30 of the world's top renewable energy companies. Well, that's down 50% in the last 3 years. It's gone down 3 years in a row. And so we have many, many examples. EVgo, for example, is a company that's a charging company. It peaked in price about $20 3 years ago. Now it's at $2.50. So a lot of these renewable companies just are not doing well. And so if you have your pension or your IRA in there, you're not making any money. So I think the financial industries are stepping back from this, and maybe this is just the first sign of that green breakdown that I predicted in my book.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I mean, they're all about profit, and if you can't make a profit on something, then it doesn't make sense. Yeah. Although we don't make a profit on the podcast.
Okay.
We can dream, though.
We can dream. But yeah, it's I don't know. There's just so much going on, so much look this way, and I feel like there's just trickery everywhere. And then there's people that we're kind of being pushed to consume Netflix and Hulu and not pay attention to anything. And I think that we've pretty much, I think most of us have pretty much lost faith in our news organizations anyway. And people just watch TikTok and, immerse themselves in entertainment and don't think about any of this. And they just trust their leaders to lead them correctly and tell them the truth. And that just hasn't been the case for a long time.
Now, people really do need to be skeptical about what they're being told about the climate, about energy, about pollution, a lot of things, because they're getting really poor messages. Another one is this net zero idea. Your listeners, your viewers should know that nothing in this world is net zero. If you build any kind of building, and you put glass into it, and you put copper into it, and you put ceramic in it, you put steel in it, if you put concrete in it, every one of those things emits carbon dioxide when it's produced and when it's transported. You can't even build a grass hut that is net zero. If you cut down grass and you cut down wood and build a hut, you emit carbon dioxide. Nothing we do is net zero. So the whole concept is flawed, and it is going to come crashing down, as I talk about in Green Breakdown.
Absolutely. Steve, are you on an island with this, or is there a group of people that are waking up? I mean, our influence is to our listeners, and your influence is to our listeners and your readers, but you also you have a higher kind of stature in society where people will listen to you. But are there other people like you, or is there everybody's just like, we'll just go along with whatever the government says?
Well, I think there are a number of folks out there. Unfortunately, this is still a minority report, and most of the world leaders, most of the top corporations have to be green. Our universities are teaching green things, but the economics and the science is going to win out, and eventually people are going to get tired of the rising energy prices, tired of blackouts, tired of being told what car to drive, what appliances they have to have. And they're gonna demand a return to low cost, reliable energy and dealing with real pollution, not carbon dioxide. So that is the future, and I'm just waiting for it to roll out.
One of the things that I love about your book is that there are slides in it. You can sit down and you can read the book when you have time, if you want to, but you can also you can pick it up for 5 minutes a day, look at the slides, learn. Pick it up for 5 minutes a day, look at the slides, and learn. It's not something where it's like this super boring book about, this what's coming. It's actually, it draws you in. It interacts with you. It's a lot different than just reading,
like a dry
1,000
academic paper.
Right.
Thanks.
So yeah, there's definitely something in it for everybody. So check that out. Where can they get your book?
Yeah, for my website, Steve Goreham, GOREHAM.com. I will send them signed copies if they want to order any of my 4 books. They're also on Amazon, and there are ebooks as well.
Okay, great. Is there anything that we missed that you wanted to get to?
Not tonight. Why don't we save it for another time? I still got to go eat supper. So,
Yeah, I feel
Well, I
bad.
hope you're not
I didn't
eating
realize how
beef.
long we kept you. Yeah, nice bowl of crickets, maybe.
no crickets.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Ryan, final thoughts on what we learned tonight.
I can see why people have a lot of trouble talking about this, or probably taking, like looking at the things that he says that probably get clipped as headlines and not just immediately dismissing it. I mean, pollution's bad, and that's what I mean. That was what we were talking about. Pollution's not good, but it's also not as simple as, cars are doing all this, oil is doing all this. There are a lot of other factors to it, and a lot of things that we need to be looking at, and probably better ways to be, allocating resources. I mean, I've read that shipping does a lot more harm than cars do as far as pollution. I mean, I do believe, some of the research papers that I've read, because I actually have read a few, and what they found seems to suggest that what we're seeing as global warming is more of just climate change, like they call it climate change now. And it's changes to the way the weather typically works, as opposed to just straight up everything's the same, but it's hotter. It's why we're seeing like wildfires, and why we have like weird storm activity, and why we have all this different, things going on that we didn't used to have, or that didn't used to be as prevalent. Maybe some of the swings are more extreme. But, these papers tend to acknowledge that when like CO2 in the atmosphere is higher, other things happen. When the planet starts to get warmer, other things happen in response to that. The way that the ocean currents flow are a little bit different, which introduces different kinds of weather in different places, because it's cooling air that's coming over the land and causing, whatever. I'm not a meteorologist or a scientist, so, but it's not as simple as stop driving your cars. I think if we all could just be carbon neutral, it'd probably be a good thing. I mean, it's not like, like he's saying, CO2 is not the most harmful thing in the world. And if we had a better balance of outputs and things that are on the uptake side of it, we'd probably be a lot better off. But yeah, I worry more about, I think, pollution than anything else. I mean, if somebody's burning yard waste or something around here, I get like a scratchy throat. If people are throwing trash, there's a lot of creeks and lakes and stuff where I'm at, and that stuff shows up in the water. I just saw some earlier. I have a like a pool skimmer just for that, pretty much.
Pisses me off, man. I'm getting fired up again, Ryan. I walk my dog and I see an uncountable amount of the little airline bottles of liquor that the gas station sells everywhere. That's a problem to me. I know that Steve will talk a little bit. Well, we're in the final thoughts. He talked a little bit about the plastic pollution maybe not being quite as bad as what we're told, but essentially the earth is its own living organism, right? And when we talk about, like, say, going on a diet, okay, well, I want to eat healthier. Okay, well, there's a cheat day built in to most diet plans, right? Because you don't want to just overreact to everything and be like, okay, I'm only eating lettuce now, because that's not healthy either. And I feel like this whole climafraud thing is like that. It's not like, let's work on finding sensible solutions. It's reactive, and it's everything has to stop now, and we're not going to look at the future because there won't be a future if we don't stop driving our gas vehicles. And that just doesn't seem to be an effective way to treat any problem. I mean, if I tried to go on a diet where I didn't have anything but like raw green vegetables, okay, well, that might be beneficial, but is it realistic? No, because I'm still going to get up in the middle of the night in a daze and be like, oh, there's a cupcake. It's you have to be sensible in your solutions.
Yeah.
And
You
if
have to have
there's,
an appropriate response.
yeah, in like, if all the towns around were all level and there were short distances, people could get by on bicycles some of the time. You're not riding your bicycle to work when it's 2 degrees out, but it's not, it's just not feasible to expect people to be able to make these kind of changes financially and within the time frame that they're putting out there. And it goes back like to you saying, here's the problem, I'm the only one with the solution, give me a bunch of money and I'll fix it. And I just have this feeling that 50, 60, 70 years from now, my kid's going to be like, man, I remember when dad talked about that. And now that all the people that were involved in that are dead, now it's coming out, oh yeah, this was just a big money grab. And then it's on to the next thing. And then 60 years down the road, they'll be like, oh, that was just a money grab, but we're not doing it this time. This time it's a real problem. And it's just a way to collect money. The subsidies are ridiculous. How many people could you feed with the government subsidies that he talked about, right?
Yeah. Or how much could you reduce taxes and help ordinary families?
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask about, but I just never found a spot to put the question in, was he what he thought of like the stop oil people, the ones, I mean, I mentioned it.
Mhm.
The people who are like gluing their hands to the road and like staying out on highways and things like that. It's a really strange, like, I get that they're trying to bring attention to it,
Mhm.
but it's like, what are we supposed to do? Like, what is your solution? Why are you doing this? Because I've seen
Yeah.
I've seen way more videos kind of attacking these people where drivers get out of the car saying, like, I'm trying to get to work, or there's a pregnant woman in this car trying to get to the hospital.
Yeah.
It's like, what am I supposed to do? GM bought out all the trolley systems 60, 70 years ago in the US to make sure that they sold more cars.
Mhm.
Like, how am I supposed to fix that now? Like, there is no public transport option for me.
Right.
Like,
Right.
if I wanted to take the bus, when I worked at the university, it took me, like 8 minutes to drive there. But if I tried to take the bus there, it would take something like 30 minutes, 35 minutes if they were running on time, because you
Yeah.
got to make a ton of stops. It's, I'm sure there are solutions for it. I mean, you could just build in more time to your schedule, but it's like, and
Not
it's hard to
me.
justify. It's hard to justify walking like a quarter mile to a bus stop, waiting there for the bus, taking a 35-minute ride, being dropped off maybe half a mile from where the
Yeah.
office was that I worked,
Mhm.
and like get in there and be all like, it was bad enough you run from one building to another as a student. It's like, I'm not doing that as a grad assistant working there. I'm not going to
Yeah.
rush in and be all sweaty and nasty. But yeah, we've been set up in such a way that we're so dependent on oil,
Yeah.
because of money reasons. Part of it's money, and I think part of it really is because the U.S. is so huge.
Yeah.
Like,
A lot of rural areas.
there's no way. Like, the highway system has allowed for like smaller towns to combine resources to create like large schools with, I mean, a lot of opportunities for kids where they, one small school for one of these smaller towns wouldn't be able to afford a drama program or a good shop class or whatever. But when you have roads and buses and things that are good enough to combine like 4 or 5 little towns, suddenly you have a population of like 75,000 people, then the couple high schools that they build are good enough to do all kinds of things or have enough resources to do all kinds of things. So it's like we talked about with farming. There are benefits to those systems as well. And I think everything is always just more complicated than one cause. Like, I think electric cars are probably the right move. Like, Kim and I could buy an electric car. Like, rather than thinking of as my car and her car, we could have 2 cars that, like, one is electric and we use it for around town stuff, and the other is gas and we use it for longer trips when we're going to see family or something like that. I mean, that's not necessarily practical for everybody, and it's kind of a little bit wasteful. So maybe the right way to do it is have an electric car for home use, if that's practical in your area, given charging capabilities and temperatures.
Yeah.
And then rent a gas vehicle for a couple days if you're going to go somewhere further away.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that forcing people to, and that's essentially what they want to do, is force everyone to have an electric vehicle, and then there will be no CO2 in the atmosphere whatsoever, except from, camels and cow butts and stuff like that.
Well,
But
us breathing.
yeah, but in my opinion, and I think this is played out over history, we can do whatever we want. And then Mother Nature will get fed up and be like, I don't care that you spent trillions of dollars on levees along the Mississippi River. I'm going to flood your ass anyway. I don't care that, you spent all this money on a seawall. I'm sending a hurricane that's going to take your town down. I don't care that everybody's driving electric vehicles when there's a solar storm and it heats up I mean, what is next? I mean, I think if you were to say if electricity was free and available everywhere, then you could say, okay, look at these options that you have now. But it's not going to be ready for when their agenda says it should be ready. And when you have big companies that, in my opinion, collude and collude with the government as well, like BlackRock and stuff like that, and they're like, well, no, this isn't looking like such a good idea anymore, then I think people need to really look at that and say, wow, if these are the the keepers of the bearers of the torch for this, and they're saying, money wise it's not going to work, why isn't everybody listening?
Well, and BlackRock is pushing a lot of social stuff too.
Oh yeah.
Like the diversity and inclusion initiatives that require just whatever they require for you to get capital from them. I've been reading that lately they're trying to pull back from that. They're kind of saying like, well, that's really this one top level guy who's really pushing that. But now they're, some of the big companies that they're investing in are losing billions of dollars because they're trying to comply with this. And they're having to like push people into positions that they're not ready for.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, we need a woman to be able to do this thing. Like, okay, here's one. She just started 3 weeks ago, but we're going to have her direct this or be in charge of this department or whatever because BlackRock says we have to. We can't allow her to work up through the ranks naturally to get there. Yeah. And it's causing, I mean, I don't know. You can say what you want about like the politics in movies, but even Bob Iger said some of the problems that they have are just not enough like supervision and oversight to some of the stuff that they're doing. Cause like the MCU movies used to have a committee that would kind of approve everything to make sure it was all on track for the overall plan. And they got rid of that. And I think part of that is wanting to allow more freedom for directors, but part of it's probably meeting some of these requirements from these investment companies.
Yeah. And when you legislate who's the best employee, I mean, that's not going to work out. When I had a CD and DVD store, I had a very diverse staff, very, very, very. And it wasn't because I was like, oh, I need a 17-year-old Latino girl to work here. It was because she was more qualified than the other candidates that applied for her position. And it's hard to say, hey, you've got this business that you have put your life into, your blood, sweat, and tears, but you don't get to pick just who's the most educated, who has the most experience. You have these other parameters that you have to cover too. And I don't think that makes business sense because, we don't see it in sports. And sports is a business. It's not like I can go and be like, to the Lakers and be like, hey, you guys don't have enough white guys on your team, man.
You
I
don't
mean, I
have the
know,
right dwarf representation on the
right.
Lakers.
Right. Because that is a laughing thing to say, right? That sounds like a bad joke, but that's kind of what's going on.
Yeah.
But nobody says, oh, well, I mean, sports teams don't care what color you are, where you were raised. They want the best athlete on the field. And I
Mhm.
think it should be the same for businesses, but that's kind of getting off topic, I guess. So
Yeah.
maybe we
Yeah.
should.
I guess my final thought with this, the final thought of these final thoughts would be that some of this stuff, like the legislation, seems like weed. When they were talking about legalizing weed, it's like it's bad. We have to be totally against it.
Mhm.
There's no compromise. There's no gray area. There's no way to work with it. But it's legal in a lot of states now, and I haven't. I mean, none of them have just had like a total societal collapse.
Right.
Like there are states where they'll talk about weed is legal, and there's like certain places where you can go if you're addicted to a drug that you can use it under the supervision of a physician,
Mhm.
which sounds crazy on one hand, but on the other hand, it's like if you're actually addicted and you want to make sure that you don't die from ODing
Right.
on it and you want help, like if you're doing something illegal and you want help for it, you're turning yourself in.
Right.
But this gives people another option, but it's more complicated than just like totally against it.
Right.
And it would be probably politically unpopular to say, yeah, fossil fuels probably will still make up 30% of what we use in 20 years because there is a place for it.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you get blowback on that. That's not what people want to hear. People have been conditioned to love being afraid. That's why true crime is so popular. That's why the news tries to scare everybody.
Yeah.
It's fear mongering. Um, Now, I did hear, and this was not from an official person at all, but somebody who within the last decade, we'll say, got a marijuana charge, and it was
Mhm.
a distribution charge. Now, aside from the fact that after this person was arrested, they only charged him with half the marijuana that they found, and they only presented half the money that he had on him uh, as evidence of sales. Hey, I don't know where that other stuff went. Where'd it go?
Mhm.
But that once it was legalized here, his record was expunged of the intent to distribute
Mm.
charge. So that's a good step that the government's
Yeah,
taking.
that
Now,
is good.
what about the people that are rotting in prison because they had 2 pounds of pot that they would sell to their friends at the Grateful Dead show? So,
Yeah,
but the
that
prison
was the
industrial complex wants those people in. So,
yeah, that's even kind of part of the opening narrative for Layer Cake
mm,
with Michael Gambon and Daniel Craig and a lot of actors that if you watched it, but they
yeah.
it starts off talking about how like back in the 60s there were guys in jail doing 10 years for robbing a bank of 10,000 pounds because it's a British movie,
Mm,
sitting next to guys who are doing like 9 months for smuggling 1 million pounds worth of pot or cocaine or whatever.
hmm
And they're like, well, we're in the wrong game. We got we got to do this.
for sure.
And yeah, I mean, even in that, they're talking about like all this stuff's going to be legal someday. So let's just make our money while we can.
Yeah,
But
it's true.
yeah, but you just need a more nuanced approach. Not all of it has to be illegal. Not all of it has to be totally legal. There's room for nuance.
Absolutely. I guess I probably should have asked if he's okay with the energy outlaw title, but I mean it as the highest compliment.
It's a
Steve,
great wrestling name.
So
we'll get him and John on.
right. No, but I mean, Steven's highly educated, well-spoken. He's the CEO type that if he walked into your business, you would be like, yes, I will put my business in your hands. And that person has sort of become an outlaw because he has a little bit of differing views. And I understand how some people may look at me and be like, oh, that guy's, he makes beats and, talks about conspiracy theory. But we're talking about someone who's extremely credible and kind of like their view isn't being taken seriously. And it just, it's sad. I did think it was interesting that he compared the Aztec sacrifices for, keeping the sun crossing the sky and not having kids out of fear. And I just thought that was a really interesting comparison. And I think that it's your God-given right and responsibility to reproduce and push your bloodline. That is what allowed us to become what we are today as humans. And I just think that's really, really sad to say, oh, you shouldn't be having kids and people believing it.
Yeah, or people being afraid to have kids because of the cost or because of the social conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of people that are like, I wouldn't bring a kid into this world.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I just recently watched The Rock again. Nicolas Cage
movie or
and Sean Connery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. yeah, where Sean Connery has to guide baby Nicky Cage through enough action scenes to become a real action hero. But towards the start of it, his girlfriend's telling him that she's pregnant. But she's like, what do you think about kids? And he's like, I think you'd have to be a fool to bring a kid into this world the way things are right now. And she's like, here's a pregnancy test. And he's like, oh, well, this is great. She's like, you just said it was terrible. And he's like, that was 7 seconds ago. A lot's happened since then.
It's pretty good. We should do a show on the escape from Alcatraz too. That might be a fun one. But yeah, that's pretty much
topic.
Yeah, that's all I've got for my final thoughts.
Yeah, me too. So if you guys want to reach out and let us know what your thoughts are, or if you own a Tesla, or if you're going to keep on with gas for as long as you can, let us know at cryptiquepodcast@gmail.com. You can support us at buymeacoffee.com/cryptiquepi, or by buying some of our wonderful merchandise at cryptiquepodcaststore.com. I was going to come up with something stupid about your designs, but I'll just say wonderful merchandise. I've been listening to, I think about some older shows like Car Talk. They talk about, you can win some of our cheap plastic junk.
Well, cut that out. All right, Crypt Keepers. Remember, if you want to save the world, start with reduce, reuse, and recycle. It costs next to nothing, and it actually has an impact. So, just put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Remember your Captain Planet lessons.
That's right. All right. Good evening, Crypt Keepers.